What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Kommander MTG YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jason Kom. This channel is all about the Kommander format with the hope of helping new players or players on a budget dive deep into the best game on the planet. Today, we have another deck tech over a recently reprinted Kommander from Double Masters called Braids, Conjurer Adept. Now, you can pick this deck up for under $45 from TCG Player, minus the basic lands, and it's definitely one you want to take a look at. First, we'll go over Braids' trigger, how we'll take advantage of it. Then we'll talk about the massive creatures you'll lay down and how you'll keep your opponents in check. And lastly, we'll go over how to keep Braids safe and keep her trigger all to ourselves. Let's get into it. Braids Conjurer Adept is a 4-mana 2/2 human wizard with the triggered ability. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player may put an artifact, creature, or land card from their hand onto the battlefield. Now, the most important thing to understand about Braids is that you won't get to take advantage of her trigger until your next turn, which means your opponents can opt into her trigger on their turn, play something huge from their hand, and then kill her before your turn starts. This would be the worst case scenario and something you need to consider every time you play her. Once your opponents see what you're laying down compared to them, they might not be so eager for you to untap with her at all. This means that playing Braids may require some political negotiation. A quick, "Hey guys, do we all want a Braids trigger?" can open up a dialogue allowing you to play Braids safely and ensure an important trigger for you. Now, I know what you're thinking. Play Braids turn 4, and then drop a 10-10 turn 5, right? Well, that might not be the best strategy. Playing mono blue leaves a lot to be desired in terms of ramp, especially when you're trying to keep it budget. You'll have to read the table and discern whether playing a 10-10 turn 5 or playing an additional land that turn is better. Don't forget, lands are the most important cards in the 99, and when your opponents are playing Farseeks or Cultivates turn 2 or 3, you'll be playing Mana Rocks, which are much more readily removed than lands. Also, getting more lands into play with Braids will lower her threat level to your opponents and allow you to have a backup plan in case they remove her repeatedly. This deck is extremely mana hungry and needs a lot of mana to work if Braids is sitting in the command zone. Now for this deck tech, we're going to focus on laying down creatures with our Braids trigger. And the creatures we're going to play are huge sea creatures, ELDRAZI, and some other fun stuff. Now let's get started. Deep Sea Kraken is a 10-mana 6/6 that can't be blocked. Serpent of Yawning Depths is a 6-mana 6/6 that makes all sea creatures unblockable, and Stormtide Leviathan, an 8-mana 8/8 with Island Walk that turns all lands into islands and prevents creatures without flying or Island Walk from attacking. Whew. If there's one thing your opponents will hate about this deck, it's getting slapped in the face over and over again with a giant fish, and there's nothing they can do about it. And I think that is freaking hilarious. Next up are two hard to remove creatures. Inkwell Leviathan is a 9-mana 7/11 with Island Walk, Trample, and Shroud. This is an amazing blocker and loves to eat blue players. If someone else is playing blue, they won't want to after this game. Next is Traumacritus, whatever, a 7-mana 8/8 that has hexproof unless it's attacking or blocking, and can't be blocked unless all creatures defending players control block it. Being an 8/8 pretty much means it will eat anything that blocks it, so don't be surprised if someone lets you swing in for 8 damage uncontested. And our last sea creature is Scourge of Fleets, a 7-mana 6/6 with, when Scourge of Fleets enter the battlefield, return each creature your opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands you control. This card is a one-sided board wipe on a fishing pole that can flat out win you the game in the right circumstances, or at the very least, set your opponents way back. Now, I chose sea creatures because they can be hard for our opponents to interact with, but I chose ELDRAZI because of Annihilator triggers. Our opponents will get to play their biggest creatures and artifacts with their Braids trigger, and we'll need a few ways to combat that. Starting with Artisan of Kozilek, a 9-mana 10/9 that has the trigger, when you cast this spell, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, this is a kind of non-bow with this deck because with a Braids trigger, we won't be casting Artisan of Kozilek at all. But that's not why it's in here. It's because it has Annihilator 2, a trigger that whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. They could sacrifice creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and even lands. There is no good option when you're facing an Annihilator 2 trigger, and this gives us an effective way to keep our opponent's boards in check and maybe even canceling out the effectiveness of their Braids trigger. Next is Bane of Bala Ged, a 7-mana 7/5 with, whenever Bane of Bala Ged attacks, defending player exiles 2 permanents he or she controls. This is an Annihilator 2 trigger on steroids. Permanently removing 2 of our opponent's threats with 1 trigger is an amazing deal and sure to put them in a tough spot. Our last Eldrazi is Ulamog's Crusher, an 8-mana 8/8 with Annihilator 2 that must attack each combat if able, which is exactly what we're going to do with it. So our last 2 bombs add a little flavor to the mix. Diluvian Primordial is a 7-mana 5/5 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you may cast up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a card cast this way would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. The amazing thing about this card is that it lets you take advantage of colors outside of blue. Imagine pulling ramp effects from all 3 opponents, or more single target removal, or even board wipes. This card can be a lifesaver or downright hilarious. And lastly is Phyrexian Ingester, a 7-mana 3/3 with Imprint, a trigger that when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-token creature. Phyrexian Ingester gets +X +Y, where X is the exile creature's power and Y is its toughness. Basically, when an opponent plays a huge threat with their Braids trigger, Phyrexian Ingester eats it and absorbs its power and toughness, becoming an even bigger threat to our opponents. Now, playing massive unblockable sea creatures and Eldrazi with Annihilator triggers is a good way to get ahead and keep our opponents down, but what do we do if we don't have any of them in hand to drop with our Braids trigger, but our opponents keep dropping bombs? That's easy. We copy them or we take them. These 4 creatures are able to copy our opponent's creatures, giving us access to effects outside of blue and a way to fight fire with fire if our opponents start to go off. These creatures are also relatively cheap to play, giving our early game some variety and flexibility to set up further turns. These next 4 cards are going to be the bane of your opponent's existence. I love the idea of our opponents playing something massive like Galta for free with their Braids trigger, being the happiest person in the entire world only to have it stolen next turn. Can you imagine the look on their face? It's hilarious. Stealing our opponent's creatures and copying them is a great way to navigate the mid-game and mix up our playstyle each game. It's always good to have some variety, especially when you're playing mono blue. Now that we've gone over what we'll play with our Braids triggers and how we'll take advantage of what our opponents play, let's talk about single target removal. First up is Capsize, a 3-mana instant that returns a target permanent to its owner's hand. But it also has a buyback 3 ability, meaning we can pay an additional 3 mana as we cast it to put it back into our hand after it resolves. This is a great answer to our opponent's threats, and it's repeatable. Its biggest downside is that it's pretty expensive, but if we're in a position to drop our bombs with Braids' trigger and leave mana open, this is a great card to have in your arsenal. Next is Runaway Together, a 2-mana instant where you choose 2 target creatures controlled by different players, return those creatures to their owner's hands. While only a temporary solution for problematic creatures, it's still a 2-for-1 that can clear blockers out of the way or simply neutralize an opponent's Braids trigger. These next 2 creatures give us some utility out of our Braids triggers. Duplicate is a 6-mana 2/4 shapeshifter that when entering the battlefield, you may exile target non-token creature. Duplicate has the power, toughness, and creature types of the last creature card exiled with Duplicate. This is another great way to deal with our opponent's creatures permanently while giving us a nice body left behind. Meteor Golem is a 7-mana 3/3 that when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Blue doesn't have great destruction effects, especially towards enchantments and artifacts, so this card will help with those annoying permanents. These next 2 are favorites of mine. Negate is a 2-mana instant that counters target non-creature spell. This card will be invaluable in the late game where you go to make a big laydown and someone tries to kill your Braids. A great cheap card that will save your butt game after game. Lastly is my favorite blue removal spell, Reality Shift, a 2-mana instant that exiles target creature. Its controller manifests the top card of their library, a very efficient and effective card that I put in almost all my blue decks because it is that powerful. Next up, let's talk about board wipes. We are running a lot of board wipe effects in this deck due to the nature of our commander. Giving our opponents the ability to play a creature, artifact, or land for free every turn can lead to some crowded and scary boards. If our other means of removal prove ineffective or we simply don't have them, we'll need these cards to bail us out. First up, these two cards protect us from one opponent by returning all attacking creatures to them. Aetherize is a 4-mana instant that returns the attacking creatures to hand, while Aether Spouts is a 5-mana instant that allows the owner the option to put them on the top or bottom of their library. These are effectively fog abilities that bounce the attackers as well and can come in handy against an opponent that really wants to swarm us. These next two board wipes give us control over what is removed. Aether Gale is a 5-mana sorcery that lets us return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands, while Curse of the Swine, a 2-mana X spell that exiles X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller puts a 2/2 green board creature token onto the battlefield. These cards are great for clearing specific threats or even giving you a one-sided board wipe effect to set you up for a big swing. These next two cards are massive bounce effects with some conditions. First is Flood of Tears, a 6-mana sorcery that returns all non-land permanents to their owner's hand. If you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control this way, you put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then we have Whelming Wave, a 4-mana sorcery that returns all creatures to their owner's hands except for krakens, leviathans, octopuses, and serpents. Flood of Tears will allow us to clear all our opponent's boards while leaving one of our massive sea creatures or ELDRAZI behind to wreak havoc. And Whelming Wave just loves fishies. Nothing better than clearing the board and slapping your opponents in the face with huge wet fish. Now that we've talked about dealing with our opponent's boards, let's talk about ramp. Being mono blue, we'll have to lean hard on artifacts to ramp us, and with Braids triggers, we could end up ramping twice in a single turn. First up is Traveler's Amulet, a 1-mana artifact that lets us pay an additional 1 mana to search our library for a basic and put it into our hand. It's a useful way to go get another land in hand to ramp out with our Braids trigger. Next is Myriad Landscape, and although this is a land, we'll have no intention of keeping it around. Myriad Landscape enters tapped, but we can pay 2 mana to sacrifice it and search our library for 2 basics and put them onto the battlefield tapped. This is the closest effect we'll get to an Explosive Vegetation in blue, and is an excellent card to play with a Braids trigger. Next up is Prismatic Lens, Seer's Lantern, Sisay's Ring, and Urgolem's Eye, letting us tap for colorless mana. Not much more to say about that. Enhedron Archive and Mindstone that also let us tap for colorless mana, but have the side benefit of drawing us cards if we need them. Lastly is Darksteel Ingot. It's indestructible and taps for 1 mana of any color. Everflowing Chalice enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it for each time it was kicked, and taps for a colorless for each charge counter on it. This is a great mana sink for those turns where we don't have a great follow-up for a Braids trigger and can easily be kicked 2 or 3 times and generating a lot of value. And finally, Kefnet's Monument, a 3-mana legendary artifact with blue creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature an opponent controls doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. An amazing ramp card for mono blue that has the side benefit of controlling our opponent's boards and even tapping down problematic creatures or blockers, clearing the way for a huge swing. With ramp out of the way, let's talk about some card draw. Chemister's Insight is a 4-mana instant that draws us 2 cards and has the Jumpstart ability, where we can cast it from our graveyard by discarding a card, hopefully a land. Next is Compulsive Research, a 3-mana sorcery where target player draws 3 cards. Then that player discards 2 cards unless he or she discards a land card. 3 mana to draw 3 cards is great, especially when we only have to discard the 1 land. This card can be a little wonky at times, but can pay off great in the right situation. Divination is a simple 3 mana to draw 2 cards, easy and effective. Next up is Fact or Fiction, one of my favorite card draw spells where you reveal the top 5 cards of your library and an opponent separates those into 2 piles. Put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. This card almost always gets me 3 cards, and since our deck is full of massive and scary creatures, watching them pick what fish at the market they want to get beat with will be hilarious. And next up is Treasure Cruise, an 8 mana sorcery that is also one of my favorites because it has Delve, where you can exile a card from your graveyard to pay for 1 mana of its casting cost. I often cast this card for 4 or less, but the more cards you delve away, the better this card gets. Next up is Muldrifter, another Commander staple where we almost are always going to cast it for its evoke cost of 3, where it is sacrificed upon entering the battlefield, but not before drawing us 2 cards. 3 mana to draw 2 cards, and getting another card into the graveyard to delve away with the Treasure Cruise? Yes, please. Next up is 4C, a 4 mana sorcery that lets us scry 4, then draw 2 cards. Talk about card selection. Being able to know what you'll pull off the top for the next few turns is a great way to synchronize your Braids triggers for max efficiency and damage. Loyal Drake is an odd inclusion, but necessary recurring card draw, where if we control our commander upon combat, we draw a card. Recurring card draw is hard to find on a budget, and Loyal Drake gives us that on a stick. It is also a cheap blocker to get out early in case our opponents get a little feisty. These next 2 cards are huge payoffs for the deck. Flow of Ideas is a 6 mana sorcery where you draw a card for each island you control. Imagine it's turn 8, you have 8 islands in play, a few Braids triggers have gone off, leaving your hand depleted, and you drop this for 6 mana to draw 8 cards. You are bound to either draw answers to your opponent's shenanigans or a big boy you need to finish out the game. Either way, you will be happy. Rush of Knowledge is an even better and likely bigger payoff. A 5 mana sorcery that draws you cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control. Remember all those sea creatures in ELDRAZI that are 6+ mana? Yeah, it's not uncommon for you to draw 6, 7, or even 10 cards with this. Talk about big time value. Next up, we have some cool synergy cards that we can either use to protect Braids or make deals with our enemies. First up is Crystal Shard, a 3 mana artifact where you can pay 3 and tap it to return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. This card can bounce problematic creatures our opponents play, but more often we will use it to bounce Braids back to our hand. Since this deck is very mana hungry and dependent on Braids to get going, we need ways to prevent us from paying commander tax. But aside from protection, these cards open up a whole different dialogue than you're probably used to. Let's say you have an opponent that has really capitalized on their Braids triggers and is wanting more. You can simply ask, if I don't bounce Braids back to my hand, will you not swing at me? Or, how much do you want another Braids trigger? You can use these Braids triggers to your advantage, keeping your permanents in play, deterring your opponents from attacking you, getting another problem off the board, etc. So many possibilities that these cards open up for you, which is just so fun. Dragon Mask and Portal of Sanctuary have similar effects with more limited uses, but can be just as efficient. Next up is one of my absolute favorite cards in all of Magic, Strionic Resonator. I run this card in so many decks, it's stupid. A 2 mana artifact that lets us pay 2 and tap it to copy target triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Imagine 2 Braids triggers every turn. And oh yeah, remember Phyrexian Ingester, Diluvian Primordial, and Ulamog's Crusher? All of these are triggered abilities you can double up and wreak havoc on your opponents. It's such an amazing, fun card that your opponents won't see coming and likely won't have answers for. The last 2 cards we're going to talk about are the best 2 cards in the entire deck and bring up an interesting mechanic most don't know about: phasing. Vanishing is a 1 mana enchantment aura that for 2 blue mana, enchanted creature phases out. And Vidalian Illusionist is a 3 mana merfolk that for 2 blue mana, you can tap it to phase out target creature. When you phase out a creature, it and all relevant auras or equipment attached to it are treated as if they don't exist. They phase in before you untap. What this means is if we phase out Braids on our turn, she doesn't change zones, our opponents can't interact with her, she's just not there until our next untap step. She phases back in before we untap our permanents, then we enter our upkeep step where Braids triggers. That means no one but us gets a Braids trigger. The look on your opponent's faces will be priceless when you are playing huge creatures for free while they get absolutely nothing. It's an amazing way of keeping Braids safe and abusing her at the same time in a really, really fun way to play Commander. To wrap up, we're going to run 37 islands in this deck to help keep it as budget as possible, and since we're playing mono blue, there really isn't much need for anything else. You can pick this deck up for under $45 from TCG Player minus the basic lands. The deck list is in the description below. Thank you so much for watching another Deck Tech, and be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. I'm Jason Komm with Kommander MTG. See you in the next one.